So thank you to everybody for being here. We are going to start this new session of the Anthropocene seminar. So in this session, we will focus a bit more on philosophical questions. In the previous sessions, we were more in the fields of environmental economy and ecology more generally. But in this session, we will listen to two philosophers, so Daniel Ross and Pieter Lemmens, who both work with the work of Bernard Stiegler, but also beyond his work, and who both work too on the questions of negentropy and of the Neganthropocene, and the links between the Technosphere, the Biosphere, and also the Noosphere, meaning noetic life more generally. So I will just let the floor to Dan in order to start, and we thank them very much for being here, and we will have a general discussion after the presentations. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Anne. I'll start. What I'm going to talk about is some of the ideas in a book by Bernard Stiegler that was never published, called Techniques and Time 4. But this is a big book, and I'm not going to say everything that's in the book or really even try to give an overview of the book, but to say something about what it contains that makes a difference to political questions as well. So even though, as Anne said, we're in a way going back to philosophy, it's going to be with a strong idea in mind of what difference does this make? What should we be for? What should we be against? And I thought I'd refer to some of the things from the last session that Mark Swilling gave in order to frame that up a bit. He talked about a quote from Manuel Castells that the space of place is being trumped by the space of flows. And I think that that's something that you could understand very easily from a Stieglerian perspective. It's a question of the character of a particular kind of locality, the kind of locality of what we would normally think of as human life. He also talked about Deleuze and Guattari having developed a theory of flows, but without reference to thermodynamics. So we know that for Stiegler, the question of entropy is important and becomes more and more important. So is this a Stieglerian statement in itself? In a way, yes, it is, but I think we have to qualify it. The question is not only thermodynamics, and I'll try to say why I think that. And it also reminded me of another statement by Stiegler that what he sees as a problem in Deleuze and Guattari is that the theory of quasi-causality that they develop becomes, for them, is about being disconnected from the traditional theory of four causes. Whereas for Stiegler, the problem is that modern science, and not only modern science, has led to the elimination of this idea for good reasons, good scientific reasons most of the time, but that in fact we have to bring this question back and integrate it with the question of quasi-causality that Deleuze talks about. Anyway, that's all a bit vague, but maybe it will become clearer. The main political point of interest in Mark's paper was when he quoted Bruno Latour saying, "But where are the passions for change is the question." And when it comes to ecological discussions, this is always what is said by people. They always say the same thing. If they want to be optimistic, they say, it's just a question of will. we can make the difference. We can fix the world, solve the problems. It's just a question of will. The key point here is the word just. What are the conditions of that will? Where do these passions come from? From my perspective, by reading Stigler's work, you can get an answer to that question that then makes a difference to what Mark also wanted to say, which is that the most radical person is the one who says, what do we do next? Because if the problem is, but where are the passions for change, then we have to ask, okay, so if that's the problem, what do we do next? What do we do next about the lack of those passions for change? And I feel like usually what happens is people just end up sort of saying, well, we have to realize that we need to do that. And that's not a very interesting answer, and it doesn't really tell us what to do. I'm also, before I get to what I'm going to say about Stigler's work, I wanted to introduce a little story that I'll just introduce now and come back to at the end, about something that's happening here in Melbourne, where I am at the moment. I'm sharing the screen already, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a high school in Melbourne that has just hired a guy, an Indigenous guy, to go through all the books in the library and decide which ones to get rid of. And they decided together to get rid of a whole bunch of books on the grounds that they're, as the headline here says, outdated and offensive books. So it's a process of what they're calling decolonization. So what should we think about this idea? Undoubtedly, it's something that would be done in the name of diversity. And everybody in the world is in favor of diversity. Diversity has become a very, it's a cliche that leaves the question of what do we mean by diversity and what are we really in favor of? And how does this question connect to questions of entropy? So I'll just leave that there and come back to it at the end. As I said in the abstract to the talk, in reading Techniques in Time 4, what you understand is that for Stigler, it's not only a question of thermodynamics. We get the idea of entropy from thermodynamics, but then he wants to generalize that in some way, or to take it to a deeper level. So the question becomes, what does that mean? Or is that just really returning it to some philosophical jargon that then really loses the meaning of entropy? And I would say that's not the case, but then you have to justify that. I think what Stigler would say is philosophy did figure out that entropy exists, but it was slow to do so. But if you read Nietzsche, entropy is there. If you read everybody who's reading Nietzsche, entropy is there. The problem is not entropy, and the problem is not thermodynamics. The problem is incorporating the notions of negentropy and what that means and how we should do that today. In other words, it's not that people didn't know about the second law of thermodynamics, it's that they didn't incorporate Schrodinger's discussion of life as a local, spatially local and temporally local struggle against this overwhelming tendency of existence. The second thing that is even less taken into account philosophically is that localities have their character because of what makes possible their organization. And what makes possible their organization is the way in which they keep the past in the present. And so what hasn't been taken into account is not only the way in which genetics and nervous systems make possible an organization of a locality so that it can maintain its consistency and its existence into the future, but the way in which for our kind of life, this involves another kind of way of keeping the past in the present in order to organize existence and a future. In other words, different kinds of retention create different kinds of localities. And in our case, that includes the retentions that are not living but dead, and create a circuit between the living and the dead that creates another kind of life with another kind of instability. And that instability is another kind of entropy. And because it's another kind, not only can we not talk about it just with entropy, we also can't talk about it just with negentropy. We need another way of thinking about this other kind of entropy that is represented by, for instance, information, in the sense that we can lose what we had in what we can lose what we know in its becoming information. And you've already heard a fair bit about that from some of the previous speakers in the series, if you're watching those previous ones. So in organic life, in endosomatic life, we can say for sure that what helps to maintain the consistency of that struggle is diversity. The diversity of organs, the diversity of species within the ecosystem, the diversity of individuals within the species. What we have to then add is diversity means the diversity of what is contained genetically or in the nervous system or retained by those forms of life in order to make possible new projections into the future. The reason we have to say that is because then it helps us to understand the question. So in the case of our kind of life, which we could call technical life, or we could call noetic life, life that knows, in other words, life that has to know, because it can't just rely on its genetic instincts. It needs to know in order to take care of these new instabilities that it itself is responsible for. For this kind of life, locality is still a question of genes, still a question of brains, but it's also a question of the accumulation of what Stiegler would call tertiary retentions, books, paintings, TV shows, movies, computers, and so on. All of the things that enable us to organize ourselves and to create a locality in which we live, with times and places that have specific characters. This quote for me is very interesting, and so I'll read it out. That the there obviously is a Heideggerian kind of reference here, but we can understand it as meaning the exosomatic locality. That the there in the biosphere could have a future in becoming neganthropic. This is the new term that Stiegler has introduced, and which we've seen in some of the previous sessions, in order to say that we can't just describe our kind of life as negentropy. It's not just that we're in a struggle against thermodynamics, it's that we're in a struggle against other kinds of instabilities, other kinds that are cliche, dogmatism, the loss of knowledge, the rise of information that destroys knowledge when it becomes a market, and so on. And the flows that that makes possible on the basis of the stocks that, as Anne pointed out, were we can understand as grammatization, the way in which temporal flows are materialized. Anyway, that the there in the biosphere could have a future in becoming neganthropic is possible because the there can be widened and deepened, even though it is nothing but surfaces. Why does he say even though it is nothing but surfaces? I think he's saying because it's in retentions. It's in retentions that are outside ourselves. We read the surfaces of writing, of what's written on the page. But those surfaces make possible a deepening and a widening. But what does that mean, a deepening and a widening? The depth is that of time. We can reach back into our retentions. We can reach back to old books, for example. Insofar as we belong to a collective individuation that provides the underpinnings for the collective retentions and protensions that tertiary retention support. And a lot of this book, Techniques in Time 4, is about the way in which the disciplines of knowledge are an organized form of retentionality that opens possibilities. Whether we're talking about mathematics, physics, sociology, or whatever, it's because we can draw on that depth that we can continue to continue to produce new forms of knowledge, and the diversity that we're talking about here is the diversity of that retentional background that we can draw on, and the way in which that past that we've kept makes possible for there to be a diversity of interpretations of that past that then open up new possibilities. And so a lot of the book is concerned with the way in which this character of formal academic knowledge is undermined by the informational systems that we have that want to replace, as he said, tend to want to replace all of those faculties of knowledge, academic faculties, with computer science that progressively eliminates the need for them in the eyes of the idolaters of computer science, information theory, algorithmic platforms, and so on, in a real way. So that more and more these faculties find themselves struggling to exist, to justify their reason for existing, and more find themselves resorting to quite limited arguments for why they should exist, because they've already given up that fight. Okay, how am I going? Yeah, I'm going all right. Now, so I want to come back to this story about the high school in Melbourne. Some of the books removed were almost 50 years old and were simply gathering dust anyway, according to the guy that they hired. 50 years is very old for a book, obviously. A lot of them have been on the shelves, untouched and unborrowed. Well, so for me, the question is here, is the problem that how old the books are, or is the problem that they're untouched on the shelves, that people are not using a library? We wouldn't accept science books being that old in the library, so why do we accept other non-fiction books to be that old? Because nothing is static. So this is an argument about diversity. This is an argument to say this library is not diverse enough. We will make it more diverse by removing those books. And what I'm saying is this the right idea of diversity? And I'm saying it's not. Maybe you do have to replace books sometimes, but the thought that lies behind this is that what is not up to date is not of value. And even in the case of science, I don't think you can say that that's the case. I'll give an example, one book that was removed. This one, A History of New South Wales. New South Wales is a state of Australia, the largest state. It was the first history of New South Wales that was written for 100 years. This is not an ancient book. It was published in 2006. For whatever reason, they judged this book is no longer acceptable to be in the library. A book that is about 15 years old. And the woman that wrote the book, Beverly Kingston, happens to be, in fact, the woman who was the first historian ever to run a course on Australian women's history in 1972.
Sto seguendo una riunione intanto.
Which is 50 years ago. But that 50 years is forgotten in the name of some other kind of diversity. But what I'm saying is what's being swept away is being swept away without really asking, what are we losing? What possibilities are we losing here? And this brings me to the quote that I really want to give you today. The there no longer being there, that is the feeling that locality is being dissolved and eliminated, that the space of place is being trumped by the space of flows. Wretched monsters return in place of what fails to return of the trauma types giving intermittent access to the extraordinary. Okay, I'll just say something about that sentence because it won't make sense otherwise. For Stiegler, the start of his thinking is the idea that we are intermittent beings. Occasionally we can access the extraordinary, some idea, some feeling of the extraordinary, but most of the time we're falling back. This intermittency is a form of the counter-entropic struggle. It's really another name for the fact that that entropy is never defeated. We are only rising and falling back and rising again, but we can never overcome entropy. When he says trauma types, what he's saying is, okay, for Simondon, the point was to, with the question of information, the point was to have a non-computational idea of information and to have a sort of more abstracted idea of information. And what Stiegler says is, the trouble with that is, in wanting to have a more abstract one that covers life, covers DNA, and covers computers, he eliminates the question of the supports of the information. And by eliminating that question, he eliminates the question of what difference it makes when you're talking about one kind of support rather than another. That is, one kind of retention rather than another. What difference it makes when you're talking about genetics or brains, or when you're talking about genetics, brains, and books and movies and so on. The difference that it makes is that our way of caring goes through this circuit with the outside. And that means caring about the future. And so when Simondon is saying the question is what difference information makes in the resolution of a tension of a system, what Stiegler would say is, but what is tension? Tension is a way of being held out to the future. And the difference that we're talking about here is the way in which in interaction with tertiary retentions, with books and so on, new thoughts, new feelings, and new ideas can occur, new desires, new ways of relating to the future. But this is not just to say that it's a question of the difference that makes a difference. Because if information was really different, we wouldn't even notice it. If it wasn't something we expected, we wouldn't even notice it. So then what does it mean to say that it does make a difference? It means he's saying that it rearranges our own retentions and protensions, our ways of being towards the future. Because some of them are unconscious, but they're unconscious potentials that can be drawn out. That's what he calls trauma types. I'm just saying all of that to explain that word. Anyway, what he then wants to say is this. This is so because the rubbish of informational, computational, and other retentional waste does not manage to decompose into humus. In other words, all of those old books, so old, so wrong, so bad, sitting on the shelf, not being read, are not, they don't have a chance to be mixed up, mixed around, recreated, and to become fertile again. In other words, the problem of diversity is not just to sweep away the past in order to make way for all these new diverse things of the present. That's no diversity at all. Diversity comes from when, in the same way as in biological life, you can mix up all your old vegetables and blah, blah, and it will become new soil that's rich with ingredients that can produce new life. Also, for our kind of life, we need to know how to decompose what we have in order to produce new. The issue is recycling. And then he says this, now such reprocessing, recycling has a name in philosophy. It is called critique, which analyzes, and he hyphenates that because he's saying it cuts it up. Critique is not criticism, critique is not attack, we critique what we love. And what critique does is to break things up, mix them around in order to create the conditions for new ideas, new desires, new wills, and new passions. We need to know how to decompose. And so when we lose critique, we lose the possibility of this recycling that is productive. In other words, what I think Bernard wanted to say to us is that all of us who care about the economics of environmentalism, of how to address climate change, and who find ourselves in a situation where all we need is will and passion, but all we have is to continually say that all we need is will and passion. What we have to do is ask, what are the conditions of renewing our relationship to our tertiary retentional past in order to deepen it and widen it, in order to analyze it, cut it up, and put it back together in new ways? And how do we have to use the technologies that we have to learn to live with in order to do that? and that this is not just a question of knowledge in the sense of scientific theories, but it's a question of knowledge in the sense of our way of caring about and organizing and loving our way into the future. And there's many more things, but I've probably taken up just about my time. Oh, maybe I've got time for this last slide. To the there that is no longer there. Again, because of the feeling that the space of place is being trumped by the space of flows, and that we therefore no longer love, because as Marco Gianpietro was saying, we have to take advantage of the myth of the unification of human society. I thought he was spot on with that idea. It's a myth. The unification of society is a myth, but we have to take advantage of the myth, which means we have to renew that myth. In other words, it's the fiction we have to find the will to live with in new ways. We have to love. We have to learn to love that myth again. We must offer a return there, the there of a taking place of biospheric locality, diversely and noetically trans-individuated, precisely so that it can and must widen and deepen itself in the reticulation of an internation where the scales of their being cross the orders of magnitude. The orders of magnitude are of the individual life, collective life, and what exceeds individual and collective life, and exceeds it infinitely. Through which, opening the dimension that constitutes the cosmos as the re-establishment of points of view between macrocosms and microcosms, psychic collective and technical individuation re-differentiates itself as cosmotechnics. For Bernard, these questions were a matter of taking what were understood as moral and ethical duties and turning them into political and economic experiments, leading to the possibility of new ways of living with technological life. What I'm saying is, what I want to say today is, and also what he's saying is, we need to know what we mean by diversely, and we need to know what we don't mean, because if we have the wrong idea of diversity, then where you end up with is really a desert. And that means we need criteria for distinguishing good and bad diversity. And if we need criteria, where do we get it? We get it from critique, and we get it from the critique of all the old criteria. But we can only do that if we hold on to that tertiary retentional history that then we have to decompose in order to recompose it in new ways. Diversity is a question of knowledge, not a question of superficial things. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Dan.
Thank you.
I think we will have many questions, but we just wait for a moment, because we are going to listen to Pieter Lemmens first. So thank you very much also for making the links with the previous sessions. And I think there are some strong links, so we will come back on it during the discussion. But we are going to listen to Pieter now. Pieter, if it's okay for you.
Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, thanks a lot, and Mikael, for this invitation to speak. I will be doing something pretty wild, I guess, pretty far out, and it's very experimental, but I thought I had to do it at some point. And it is trying to see how the psychedelic, what I would call the psychedelic pharmacon, should be considered from a Stiglerian perspective. It's not worked out. It's mostly an exploration. It's an opening up of a horizon, the evocation of a new field that might be interesting for us also to explore. And I hope I'll be able to get it across in 35 minutes. That's how I did it. So bear with me. In this talk, I'm going to present something rather unusual and unexpected in the context of a philosophy seminar such as this one. Unexpected also for myself not so long ago, actually. And I have to say that I consider this talk to be something of an experimental contribution to one of the stated aims of this seminar, that is opening new perspectives for the future of and in the Anthropocenic technosphere. I'm convinced, despite its unfamiliarity and admitted far-outness, that it makes sense to introduce it in this context of a philosophical seminar about the biosphere and the technosphere in the age of planetary crisis and the Anthropocene, renamed the Anthropocene so aptly and elegantly by our deceased philosophical mentor, and addressed by him foremost as a noetic and a libidinal issue, as being ultimately a crisis of the mind and of desire, and from his technocentric perspective, therefore fundamentally a technological, and that is to say pharmacological crisis. I am going to talk today about a different pharmacon, one that is overlooked, consciously or not, in our great mentor's phenomenal diagnostic and therapeutic regarding today's global economies and ecologies of desire, attention, perception, and cognition, and that is the pharmacon of psychedelics, or entheogens, as many prefer to call them. A pharmacon, as I want to show, that has a tremendous potential to change our minds, to put it with Michael Pollan. Psychedelics are genuine pharmaca, as I will argue, and that is to say both in the Stiglerian sense, I presume, and in the sense that most people normally understand this term nowadays from a neuropharmacological perspective, as pharmaceuticals, or indeed drugs, which rather dramatically, to be sure, affect the neural functioning of the brain and therefore its conscious experience in either healthy or unhealthy ways, depending on the way their users attend or not to what is generally called set and setting. Also, their potential for healing, for taking care of our heavily tormented industrialized souls is enormous, unmatched by anything else in my view. And I will come back to this. Psychedelics are eminently noetic in the sense that they have the capacity to open up, reveal, or expand the human psyche or mind toward perceptive, cognitive, and affective, and indeed spiritual dimensions that it cannot access in its normal, sober state. The delic in psychedelic comes from the ancient Greek term delaun, which means to manifest or to reveal. Psychedelics induce what are called altered states of consciousness and allow the mind again to access realms of perceiving, knowing, thinking, and feeling, and very possibly also realms of reality, which normally remain close to it. Realms also in which it is able, arguably, to make contact with the divine. Therefore, the notion of entheogen, generating the divine within, and not as an illusory projection or hallucination as materialist reductionists, as well as most Western or Westernized subjects are prone to object right away, but as a genuine, heartfelt encounter, as the experience of a real presence, to use an expression by George Steiner. But first of all, in this seminar's context, as I will argue with many authors who have written about them from personal as well as transpersonal experience, psychedelics are noetic deconditioning agents, substances that can temporarily liberate the mind from the kinds of psychological, social, cultural, historical, and indeed also technological conditions and conditionings within which it is normally imprisoned, and thus allow it to roam beyond the confines of what is sometimes called consensus reality. It is this uniquely powerful capacity, along with their remarkable, indeed profound potential, increasingly acknowledged currently in psychiatry, to heal the human psyche from a whole range of traumatic disorders and other psychopathologies, that makes psychedelics, as I want to claim, an important topic for philosophers as well to ponder, in particular for those who consider the human condition as a technical condition. Thus far, however, barring a few exceptions, philosophy has not really caught on, which is unfortunate since psychedelics hold the still unacknowledged promise of opening up philosophical reflection to unknown, or maybe just long forgotten, epistemic and ontological territory. It has to regions of thinking and being wildly exceeding the sanctioned and anxiously policed borders of respectable science and philosophy. But was it not Stigler's mentor, Jean-François Lyotard, who wrote that being prepared to receive what thought is not prepared to think is what deserves the name of thinking? In this talk, I want to explore in a first cautious attempt of how we might be able to integrate the incredibly rich empirical and conceptual treasure trove that has emerged from psychedelic exploration over the last couple of decades, both officially in academic settings and unofficially in the underground, within the Stiglerian interpretation of the human condition as a technical and in that sense pharmacological condition, and how it may allow us, on the one hand, to point to the limitations of that interpretation, but also, on the other, to expand it toward domains that it has neglected or even outrightly denied a priori based on certain ontological predispositions, inherited rather unquestioningly, I would agree, from mainstream modern philosophy. And let me say immediately that I have in mind, first of all, Stigler's explicitly embraced materialism here. A materialism admittedly not of the ordinary or vulgar kind, which insists that everything, including the mind or spirit, can be reduced to matter, but a materialism nevertheless, characterized by Stigler himself as spiritual, in that it holds that matter is the condition of everything spiritual. Matter here referring first of all to material artifacts, of course. Given the theme of this seminar, I will specifically address the question of whether and how psychedelic experiences may give us cause to reconsider and reimagine the noosphere as not simply coextensive in a spiritual materialist sense, say, with the technosphere, which would be Stigler's viewpoint, I assume, and not only anthropic either, but as something much broader and also much stranger and uncanny, to be honest. So as to include not only vegetal, mycelial, and animalistic intelligences, but also, most importantly for my purpose here, otherworldly and divine ones, indeed understood in an arguably transcendent, but actually still to be more specified sense, which are not, or at least not necessarily mediated through and or conditioned by the technosphere as we know it, but that can be accessed and communicated and or communed with by humans nonetheless through alternative means. And not only through psychedelics, to be sure, although these substances demonstrably support such access in exceptionally profound and reliable ways. And considering the crucial and steadily growing importance given by Stigler to understand the psyche and the mind explicitly from the perspective of entropy and negentropy, or rather their anthropic varieties of entropy and negantropy, I will also question whether the transcendent, and let me stress, not transcendental sources and dimensions of intelligence, knowledge, and insight, which can arguably be accessed via the psychedelic experience, can be captured within Stigler's spiritual materialist, organological, and nooenergetic conception of the mind, and indeed of the techno-noosphere, and are therefore similarly subject to the law of entropy in the way imagined by Stigler. Or whether, if this is not the case, we should consider opening up Stigler's organology toward domains that are not exclusively of the order of matter, the organic, and operativity. How unrealistic and downright fantastic, if not ludicrous, this may seem from within a strictly Stiglerian perspective, outright critical, if not aggressively dismissive, as it habitually responds to any suggestion of the transcendent, the divine, and the religious, or in short, as I like to call it, the vertical. This dismissal is apparent, for instance, in Stigler's fierce rejection in the Age of Disruption of Heidegger's notorious assertion in the Spiegel interview that only a God can still save us. What can only still save us from the virtually hopeless situation in which runaway global techno-capitalism has brought us cannot be a God for Stigler. This is inconceivable. But nonetheless, he conceives it in terms of a miracle. But the only miracle he ever allows for is the purely immanent and purely materialist, indeed purely naturalist miracle of negative entropy, i.e. of negentropy or anti-entropy, which he considers to be the true, that is to say, thermodynamic understanding of what traditional monotheism, ignorant of the insights gained by contemporary thermodynamics, imagined as God. This miracle, this possibility of a miracle, is what he called the Anthropocene, and it is this purely material and highly improbable possibility of a negentropic or negantropic turn or bifurcation in technology, which would be a pharmacological term, that we should start believing in, that we need to start believing in for the sake of humanity's survival and future thriving on the planet. This belief is the belief in the principle and seemingly exclusive saving power of the pharmacon that is technology, digital technology more precisely, and it presupposes the taking care of its entropic and anthropic effects so as to render them negentropic or neganthropic, and that is to say therapeutic, pharmacologically curative, i.e. healing. What I want to suggest here in this talk is that there exist other pharmaca, non-technological pharmaca, which may open us up or attune us toward the possibility of experiencing other reality domains and ultimately renewed encounters with the divine, different in many ways from those of traditional monotheism, but just as miraculous and thus enable access to a wholly different saving power. Saving first of all in the sense of granting the possibility, if only temporarily, of deconditioning us noetically from our technical conditions and conditionings, and as such, eventually, of helping us to heal ourselves from our toxic technicization, industrialization, and automatized dissociation, our current state of madness, in short. And if we decide to take seriously the experiences of the majority of psychonauts by reawakening us to our ultimately divine origin, an anamnesis far more original than the Platonic one, although this depends, of course, on one's interpretation of Plato. I'm fully aware of the fact that I'm guilty here of committing utter sacrilege for believers in the absolute creed of materialism, dogmatically unwilling to entertain the possible existence of a non-material or supernatural reality accessible by humans. This is the ultimate blasphemy also in the eyes of our current masters, represented intellectually by their co-opted half-wit and ultra-nihilist prophets of doom, such as Yuval Noah Harari, who imagines his fellow human beings to be nothing but miserable, hackable animals, increasingly superfluous to the capitalist mega machine, and thus to be migrated into puny virtual reality surrogate worlds, of which Facebook's Meta and Microsoft's Next VR and mixed reality are undoubtedly the first clunky prototypes. But before I will address this deconditioning and entheogenic as well as ecodelic nature of the psychedelic experience and what it may teach us about the mind and the planetary, and by extension even cosmic noosphere, as it may escape the materialist framework adopted by Stigler somewhat too dogmatically, in my opinion, I feel that I first have to briefly convey something about my own experience with psychedelics. In particular, my mouse is not working anymore. In particular with ayahuasca or yage, the Amazonian plant-based psychedelic used by indigenous people from that region for a long time, but since a decade or three also discovered by Western practitioners, which has for me personally become the accident, becoming the event as it were, to which I feel obliged more and more to stay true or remain faithful, so to speak. Quasi-religiously maybe, and indeed somewhat similar to the way in which this staying true is evoked by Stigler when he speaks with considerable pathos of remaining faithful with dignity or worthiness to the wound or injury caused by the accident of technology, i.e. by the shock of a new pharmacon intruding upon one's existence, although both the accidental and the evental in this sense assume an entirely different meaning from the unexpected noetic and ontological horizon that the pharmacon of ayahuasca opens up within one's psyche. And the wound it has caused, albeit mind-shattering, turned out to be the very opposite of a wound. Indeed, it was rather the experience of a healing, a profound healing that is of wounds that I never imagined to possess. I will not go into the specific details of these experiences here, but let me say that drinking the vegetal pharmacon that is called ayahuasca in a ceremonial, in my case neo-shamanic setting, has unexpectedly opened me up viscerally, undeniably, and irrevocably to experiential and arguably also epistemic and ontological domains far beyond what I deemed possible before based on my implicit metaphysical assumptions. And it was precisely this full-blown encounter with something unmistakably sacred, something palpably holy that was profoundly healing for me, indeed immensely liberating in a way that no other experience in my life had ever been, not even close. Drinking ayahuasca in the context of a traditional ceremony led by an experienced and dedicated shaman or curandero allows one to enter in a guided manner into an otherworldly, multidimensional, phenomenal universe that is sometimes breathtakingly beautiful, blissful, and ecstatic, sometimes suffocatingly hideous, horrifying, and depressing, but always sacred and virtually always resulting in a profound healing, a blessed feeling of being touched or rather permeated and thereby revitalized within the deepest core of one's being by a tremendous, undeniably intelligent source of spiritual energy that on the one hand feels eerily immanent to one's own being, indeed hyper-immanent, but on the other utterly transcendent and alien. It is this encounter with what is experienced by virtually all users of ayahuasca as something divine, very much as in mystical experiences, that forms the true principal agent behind the healing impacted on them. It is not surprising that plants such as ayahuasca are called plants of the gods by those familiar with them. Before continuing to describe the extraordinary phenomenology of these experiences in some more detail and speculating about the epistemic and ontological implications one might garner from them in the light of Stigler's technology-centered organological and pharmacological understanding of the noetic and the planetary techno-noosphere, I want to confess that I frequently wondered, especially after learning about his suicide in August 2020, how Stiegler would have responded, both existentially and philosophically, if I had taken him to an ayahuasca ceremony and he would have experienced the powerful effects of this magical jungle brew on his own consciousness. What could it have taught him and what would it have taught him? What impact could it have conferred on his thinking or on his life? Could it have been as profound and metanoetic as, allegedly, Foucault's famous experience with LSD in the Californian desert in 1975 had been? People drinking ayahuasca or taking another psychedelic for that matter, such as LSD, mushrooms, peyote, iboga, or San Pedro, often report it to be the most important experience of their lives, and not infrequently as being a life-changing experience. For me personally, at least, it profoundly affected, indeed unexpectedly expanded the view of myself as a human being and of human existence more generally, recalibrating as it did my existential outlook and perception of reality by opening up and thrusting my psyche into unsuspected realms of consciousness and offering glimpses into what appear to be other dimensions or planes of reality, populated with all kinds of other entities and beings unaccounted for in our materialist reductionist ontologies, all the while being showered with divine, illuminating and healing energies and flooded with Niagaras of beauty, to quote psychedelic explorer extraordinaire Terence McKenna. My experiences with ayahuasca frequently bordered on madness, definitely, but they consistently brought greater sanity and clarity of mind and a powerful, indeed extraordinary existential empowerment and liberation in the end. I have hardly known Stiegler on a personal level, so therefore obviously I cannot claim any insight into his mental condition, but I was shocked by his suicide and also saddened by the increasingly dark, desperate, and depressing mood looming from his later writings, however legitimate and understandable given our dire current predicament, which culminated in some very candid and moving confessions about his regularly returning bouts of depression and literary melancholy in chapter 12 of The Age of Disruption, about his treatment with the antidepressive neuropharmacon Laroxil and how it negatively interfered with his practice of reading and writing as a technique of the self, as a way of treating himself through the literary pharmacon of writing, the technique he excellently learned to master in an exceptional manner while in prison, and which made him the philosopher that he became and that we all admire. But even more so in the concluding chapter of that book, on the need to dream and to struggle for a pharmacological turn, where he admits to be very depressed and even in absolute despair sometimes, given the real prospect of a total collapse of civilization and the utter improbability of a positive negentropic bifurcation of its current hyperentropic trajectory, exacerbated to an unbelievably vile and violent degree since his passing, by the way, only to be averted by that incredibly secular miracle that he called the Negantropocene. Without in any sense willing to assume a direct connection between his depression and his suicide, what I would like to suggest, though, is that an encounter with ayahuasca in a supporting ceremonial context could at least have granted him the experience of a profound healing, thanks to the intrinsic healing effects of this plant medicine, as it is often called, a medicine, as I want to stress here, that is considered to possess its own inherent intelligence, an intelligence far beyond that of the human and of a profoundly different kind, indeed that is somehow of a vegetal nature, but at the same time experienced as being of a divine order by virtually anyone who takes the courage to imbibe the brew made of this teacher plant, as it is often called, and allow it to do its cleansing and cathartic work on one's body, mind, and spirit, a cleansing and a catharsis accompanied consistently with experiences of illumination and spiritualization. Indeed, as the American philosopher and professor of religious studies William J. Barnard claims in his recent book on the Brazilian ayahuasca religion Santo Daime, of which he has been an active member for years, the ayahuasca experience allows for a temporary merging of our own, in Stiegler's Freudian terminology, libidinal energy with divine energies, and as such grants us the possibility to undergo what early Christian church fathers such as Clement of Alexandria called divinization or theosis, the process of becoming godlike and of embodying various divine qualities. Indeed, as Barnard conveys, in an ayahuasca ceremony, we are given the profound honor of having the opportunity to repeatedly dive into a vortex of high-level, inherently sacred and deeply transformative energies. Let me simply confess that I would have loved Stiegler to having been granted such an experience of immersion into an energetic and indeed noetic dimension, so tremendously healing and elevating, the existence of which I suspect he did emphatically not believe in, let alone want to believe in, not even for a second. And just for the record, there is now ample empirical evidence also from scientific quarters that ayahuasca, among other psychedelics, is very effective in treating depression and will in the near future most certainly be legalized for such a purpose. It is this temporary merging with the divine, with a truly transcendent level and intensity of energy that is not simply libidinal, not simply human, and therefore, as I would like to put forward here as a question rather than a mature hypothesis, indeed as a mystery, not subject to the materialist, anthropic or anthropic tendency of the libidinal and the noetic in the way imagined and theorized by Stiegler, but that thoroughly affects this libidinal energy by elevating it to a superhuman level that is offered to us by the psychedelic pharmacon, and that is hard to account for, or so it seems, on the basis of Stiegler's spiritual materialist, quasi-causalist organology and pharmacology of noesis. Let me return to the issues put forward in the beginning of this talk. That is, to my suggestion that psychedelics as psychopharmaceuticals may also be considered as pharmaca in a more or less Stieglerian sense, but that their use is not so much conditioning our perception, attention, cognition, and thinking of modalities in certain ways as the literal, analog, and digital nemo, psycho, and no technologies studied by Stiegler and other contemporary thinkers of technology principally do, but are rather deconditioning them, taking them offline or decoupling them, as it were, from normal or consensus reality circuits and taking them into other, relatively uncharted realms, into what is sometimes called an inner Antarctica, which psychonauts all over the world are now only starting to explore. An inner Antarctica, by the way, that grants access to the farthest reaches of the outer cosmos. And these explorations, I claim, almost inevitably lead those who embark them to question, and that is to say, fundamentally question the very nature of reality, and most often to call into question the materialist ontology that underlies our Western and nowadays global capitalist scientist culture of incessant production, consumption, and innovation. This is also the reason why they are so threatening to that culture and thus far strictly banned by it, although things are rapidly changing at the moment, possibly because of the severity of the crisis. The fact that psychedelics are deconditioning agents seems also to be confirmed by contemporary brain research, in particular that of the group led by Robin Carhart Harris from the prestigious Imperial College in London, which has demonstrated through fMRI brain scans that psychedelics deactivate the so-called default mode network, which is thought to support the normal sober state of consciousness generally referred to as the ego, which controls and holds together the personality and perceptive and cognitive faculties of the normally functioning human psyche, and which is perfectly adapted to consensus reality. Psychedelics dissolve the ego and thereby breach the boundaries between the self and the larger environment, between the I and the other, frequently leading to what mystics and religious scholars call unio mystica. Interestingly, in light of Stiegler's no-energetic or noothermodynamic understanding of noesis, Carhart Harris claims that psychedelics induce what he refers to as entropic brain states, which is to say that they produce a phase transition from the default low entropy state of the brain toward the more chaotic, less orderly high entropy state, which is considered to be the more primitive one and which is characterized by much more interconnectivity and integration between the various parts of the brain. This state thus allows for the formation of new associations among the various psychic and noetic faculties, some awakened, or so it seems, for the first time in the psychedelic state itself, and which may explain the healing potential of psychedelics. It may obviously also explain the brain's ability under the influence of psychedelics to access otherwise inaccessible realms of experience, of knowledge, and possibly also of reality, relatively unexplored thus far because of what Thomas Roberts has called the single state fallacy, the myopic assumption that our normal waking state exhausts all our noetic capabilities. This seems to go against Stiegler's exclusivist identification of knowledge as a cosmic factor with negentropy, indeed as inherently negentropic. Temporarily disengaging the brain from its baseline low entropy to a higher entropy state may allow it to access domains of knowing, perceiving, and intuiting, and therefore other domains of reality, if one is willing to acknowledge their existence, that may ultimately be vital to our survival and our thriving on the planet and in the larger cosmos. What it teaches us at the very least is our profound immersion in the earth as well as the larger ecosystem, and that is to say in a deeply felt visceral sense, as the American author Richard Doyle emphasizes, who considers psychedelics to be, first of all, ecodelic, meaning inducing sudden bouts of interconnection, the perception of being enmeshed by the terrestrial and extraterrestrial ecology, the tuning into the ecologos. And here you have your ecological passions, I would say, delivered on a plate. Psyche or ecodelics thus may be helpful, I claim, in opening up unexpected imaginative portals that can be very useful for the neganthropos to come, for navigating the chaotic, stressful, and no doubt onto-apocalyptic times ahead of us. However this may be, and there's much more to be said here, obviously, it is a fact that psychedelic experiences consistently force those who have them to fundamentally reconsider their ontological commitments and epistemic assumptions. More than anything else, and in a sense much, indeed vastly much more, I would argue, than the arrival of a new system of technical pharmaca, do the psychedelic pharmaca put Dasein's understanding of itself and of the world into question, albeit in a very different, but nonetheless just as important and serious way, I want to suggest. I can here give only the slightest impression of the huge variety of phenomenal experiences that psychedelics offer, but these vary from vivid re-experiences of past life episodes, past lives and past stages of evolution, shapeshiftings into animals and encounters with spirits, demonic and angelic beings, to experiences of universal and cosmic consciousness, visions of the future of humanity, and unification with the divine ground of being. One persistently reported characteristic of such experiences is that they are perceived to be more real than real. Authors such as Robert Masters, Gene Houston, Stan Groff, Ralph Metzner, Rick Strassman, Benny Shannon, Luis Eduardo Luna, Christopher Bach, G. William Barnard, and many, many others have catalogued the infinitely rich and bewildering phenomenology of the psychedelic experience. One particular term for these experiences coined by the community of aficionados of dimethyltryptamine, or DMT, an extremely powerful endogenous psychedelic that propels users instantly into what they call hyperspace, sums up the ontology-shattering capacity of the psychedelic pharmaca. Quite poignantly, they describe the DMT experience as an ontoseismic experience, indeed as causing an ontological earthquake, an ontological shock that frequently flips them instantly into another non-materialist conception of reality. The more than real hyperspaces populated by a huge plethora of strange extra-dimensional entities bent on communication and interaction with those who meet them, and I can recommend consulting the so-called hyperspace lexicon on the DMT Nexus website to get an idea of the exuberant variety of entities encountered in DMT hyperspace, compel users post festum to radically reconsider their understanding of being, as Heidegger might put it, and to seriously entertain the possibility of a more pluralist, indeed more multidimensional or multiplanar conception of reality as consisting of more than one single plane, that is to say, the material one. There might therefore also be other non-technical or alter-technical milieus of the noetic soul. Psychedelic experiences, I argue, profoundly challenge some of the assumptions behind Stigler's technocentric, nooenergetic and spiritual materials conception of the noetic as fully embedded within the thermodynamic matrix of the planet and subject to its entropic pool, albeit deferred, of course, in an extra-organic way through the pharmacon of technology. The transcendent, reportedly divine nature of the phenomena encountered, as well as the profound knowledges obtained through such experiences, the compellingly real presence of otherworldly and extra-dimensional entities consistently reported, the mystical union with the very source of being, the unmistakable sacrality and sanctity viscerally felt in these states, the non-local space and time transcending nature of the experiences, the confirmed precognitions and prophetic insights and the direct intuitive apprehensions gained from it, the divine ecstatic states of bliss or Satchitananda experienced in it, as well as the thoroughly ineffable nature of what is experienced, all these characteristics of the psychedelic experience, and I'm fully aware they can be all too easily dismissed by any outsider and explained away as nothing but comforting illusions from a cynical naturalist reductionist viewpoint deemed superior, encourage me to put forward the question here of whether Stigler's conception of the noetic, innovative and profound as it is, should be taken as the final word as we aim to prepare for the Neganthropocene of what humans as libido-noetic creatures are capable of. Some characteristics of the Stiglerian framework that might be questioned proceeding from the psychedelic phenomenon, as all too briefly presented in the above, are its fervent adherence to materialism, albeit a spiritual one, its exclusive focus on the human as a social, cultural, historical, and politico-economic being, its total inscription of the noetic in the energetic thermodynamic matrix of the planetary bio and technosphere, its nearly exclusive cognicentric focus on rationality and reason, and its total neglect of the ecstatic, the gnostic, the intuitive, the mystical, the visionary, the magical, and the shamanic dimensions of noesis, which are all not irrational, but definitely beyond the rational, as savoir-faire, savoir-vivre, and savoir-théorique. If we take seriously as the exponents of the so-called ontological turn in contemporary anthropology urge us to do with respect to indigenous ontologies and epistemes, the ontological and epistemic conundrums thrown at us through the use of psychedelic pharmaca, and if we seriously take account of what two of the most prominent and respected scholars in the field of psychedelic research maintain, namely that the basic message of the entheogens is that there is another reality that puts this one in the shade, as Huston Smith has argued, and that each human being contains information about the entire universe or all of existence, has potential experiential access to all its parts, and in a sense is the whole cosmic network, as Stanislav Grof claims, based on decades of research and copious amounts of empirical data, then we should be willing to admit that human beings as noetic and libidinal creatures cannot be reduced, as is most often the case, not only in Stigler's work, but in nearly all contemporary philosophy and theory, to the historically, culturally, and technologically conditioned and fully material processes of psychosocial individuation, processes constantly, and as it seems most often in vain, struggling for their precarious autonomy inside a socio-technical matrix implanted on a fundamentally hostile and barren planet. Psychedelic experiences simply won't let you get away with this limited conception of what it means to be human. We can talk in Foucaultian terms about psychedelic exploration as a technique of the self and as a practice of freedom. However, the self that is practiced and cultivated here is a deeper or higher self, a more encompassing self, a larger and mostly unconscious self, one that has been explored in great depth by Carl Jung, but was more or less discarded by his mentor Freud. And if we had to characterize psychedelic techniques of the self, we could refer to Mircea Eliade's famous notion of techniques of ecstasy, introduced in his 1964 book on shamanism to identify shamanic practices all over the world for inducing trance states. Psychedelic techniques of ecstasy, I argue, should be taken into account, and I mean seriously, in our research into the human condition as a technical condition, and our search for what Stigler calls noodiversity and Hui technodiversity. And that is to say, in the sense of a vital counterpart to the techniques of rationality, today principally digital, which we are engulfed by and saturated with at the moment, and which threaten to absorb all our attention, deadening our genuine spiritual antennas, which psychedelics are capable to activate and attune. I'm almost finished. Psychedelics are also perfect tools, I would like to suggest in finally ending this talk, for practicing a decolonization of our minds, to vary a little upon Eduardo Vivaros de Castro's characterization of anthropology's critical mission, namely the permanent decolonization of thought. They can help us to rediscover, to restore, and to rescue our own indigenuity, to speak with the German thinker Andreas Weber. They are, in a sense, in Hui's terminology, an alternative cosmotechnics, though neither a Western one, nor an Eastern or a specifically indigenous one, but one that is genuinely planetary, spreading rapidly across the globe at the moment, and, as I would like to conclude, urging us to enlarge the conception of ourselves, to expand our view of the noosphere, i.e. as a planetary and even cosmic community or ecology of souls beyond the technosphere, and including what Canadian anthropologist Wade Davis calls the ethnosphere, and to widen our conception of what a future no-diversity might look like, and finally, to think more broadly of what it may take to re-elevate, and yes, re-enchant the anthropos, and help it in becoming the neganthropos as a genuine homo spiritualis. This was my talk.
Thank you very much, Pieter. Thank you very much. It was very, very stimulating. So we are going to launch the discussion now. I think that, I mean, I could ask many questions, but maybe we can open the discussion to the public. Thank you very much for your two presentations. I think it was really just maybe to say a word for the people who are trying to be present to all the sessions of this seminar. In this session, the question was more about like what we could call spiritual energy or libidinal energy, and the way to let's say to think about that, I guess more in the political sphere with Dan, and more in the spiritual or mystical or sphere with Pieter. So I think there are lots of lots of things which are linking your two talks. But so maybe we can. So Benoît wants to say something.
Before Benoît, it was l'association des amis de.
Okay. So l'association des amis de la génération Thunberg. Then Benoît, then Morten, and then I will ask some questions. Okay, so Association des Amis de la Génération Thunberg. we don't know who is behind the session, so maybe you can just say who you are before you speak, and then it will be great.
Can you hear me? The sound is good.
The sound is very bad. Yeah, really bad.
I try something.
So perhaps can you fix the problem, and Benoît can ask his question if it is possible.
You receive me?
Yeah.
Sorry if the sound is bad because I'm traveling, and so it's Mary from the association created by Bernard Stiegler 2 years ago. And I would like to thank Mr. Lemmens for his talk, because as I said in the discussion, I also practice psychedelic experience, and I try to make sense of it with the theory of anti-entropy. And I'm working on it with the researcher Giuseppe Longo and Mael Monteville. And I totally I'm not totally, but I really understand what you say, and sorry, I have a lot of emotions, because this weekend I took ayahuasca 3 times, and also what's his name before, Alvarez, and it's really powerful. And I also lived what's his name ego death. So total ego dissolution, and it makes really sense with what you said, and also the other topics about love, the negentropy as love, and I'm not talking that much about it because it's not good condition, but really thank you.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. So Benoît, maybe you can ask your question, or maybe Pieter want to react, but I think
maybe
there was
I think did you make the same, because in the chat there's also a kind of message by the Association des Amis de la Génération Thunberg. I think it's yours.
I think this is the same person.
Yeah, the same person. Yeah, ego death is pure anti-entropy. Yeah, I'm not sure. It's sometimes very difficult to transplant or to put Bernard's quite thermodynamic scientific interpretation of what the mind and the noetic is, to bring that into dialogue with real spiritual discourse, right? It's what what is ego death negentropic or anti-entropic? Yeah, maybe. It certainly brings a lot of clarity, and it certainly brings a lot of sanity in the mind, and it certainly ignites what Dan called the ecological passions. Everybody taking these pharmaca is perfectly aware and willing to take care of the planet. That's what I see with everyone getting involved in these practices. The earth is immediately present, right, in some sense, and in a completely different sense, of course, than the scientific sense. It's not the planet of Earth system sense that we get to know in these experiences, but a very different one. Yeah. So, but yeah, is ego death pure entropic? I'm not sure. It's very difficult to put it that that explicitly. Okay.
Yes, it's also a problem that we often have, because this is a kind of metaphorical use of scientific terms and scientific notions, and we have to be very careful with that. And Bernard Stiegler was also very careful with this kind of transfer of concept. So maybe it is the case, but it would have to be justified in a philosophical or scientific discourse and argumentation, I think.
Yeah.
So Benoit maybe, and Morten after.
Yes. Yes. Am I heard?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I will start by thanking Anne and Michal for organizing those talks. I've been inviting several times by Anne, and I never showed up, and I regret I haven't done it before. And I'm very pleased also to see Dan, that I haven't seen for a long time. I really liked his talk, but I would like to answer to Pieter Lemmens' speech that I found very interesting and challenging, because it's obvious that there are links that we can make between the use of psychedelics and the general sense of given by Bernard to the word pharmacon. I'm sure it will please Christian Billy, that is here, and he has made many research about it. And maybe it's interesting because it tells us about the process we encounter every time new techniques arrive in the social field, in terms of phase shifting, or phase shifting, déphasage, as we say with Simondon. You know, there are two phases, a phase E and a phase B, and between those two phases, there is a liminal state, which is probably what you encounter through those rituals with ayahuasca or LSD or psychedelics. I've never used myself psilocybin on a high dose, so I can't really give a testimony or witness. But my concern is that all those rituals that are actually well known through anthropology, even though it's not so much documented, this liminal state is a moment where we are also highly suggestible. We know that the first experiments that were made in the mid-50s were organized by the work of Gordon Wasson, that worked for CIA, and there were evidence that it was easy to manipulate people using LSD and so on, and we are making the same thing with the use of technology. And I think one of the problems, and that's the points of the discussion I would like to submit, is the fact that all those rituals are not surrounded through a framework that in the past was embodied by tradition. There is no tradition rely on to those liminal states that we live through the phase shifting. And I think that's a big problem. It's the same problem that we encounter with sacrifice. There is a necessity to sacrifice, but at the same time, we don't have any kind of tradition to rely on. So that's the concern I'm sharing with you. And so I would like probably to hear you, Pieter, about this. And I'm also curious to hear about what Dan has to say about it. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Benoit. It's a very interesting, critical question, of course, about the suggestibility. That is, of course, one thing, and about the lack of symbolic frameworks, right? Real ritual frameworks. But I think to start with the first comment, there is a big difference at the moment with the 1950s and the 1960s, when indeed Gordon Wasson and Timothy Leary and many others went to South America and took LSD, etc., etc. There was no symbolic structure. There was no symbolic framework, and that's also one of the reasons why it went completely wrong, right? Think of Timothy Leary. But ayahuasca comes with a symbolic framework, comes with a ritualistic framework. It does not come all by itself. It comes with all kinds of rituals. Of course, the question is, can these rituals, which originated in South America, can they be transplanted here to the West? Well, I can I can report that it is possible. I'm part of a Shuar community from a shaman coming from Ecuador, who has, let's say, planted this ritual here, which took a very long time to teach the people to do it, because this ritual is a very, very precious and very sophisticated, what I always call a theotechnology, right? And it's only in this theotechnological context, this ritual, which is very precise, which has to be monitored very carefully by a practitioner, by a shaman. It's only in this ritual context that the profound effects of a psychedelic such as ayahuasca can come to the fore, can also be monitored and steered and processed by community. So this community and this symbolic framework is very important. Yeah? So I think there's a big difference, and there's of course a big danger when psychedelics are being used wildly by people who don't know anything about it and who plunge themselves like without any knowledge in these, well, let's put it frankly, dangerous spaces. These experiences are really very fundamentally shattering really everything that you thought to know about the world, right? So this symbolic context is very important. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the ayahuasca religions that have come up in this century in Brazil, like the Santo Daime and the Unhago do Vegetal and the Barquinha religions, which are really also acknowledged by the Brazilian state, religions that consider this ayahuasca to be their sacrament, right? And even, let's say, their deity. Which is a mixture of Christian religion and shamanic religions. So there is this context, there is this ritual context present with ayahuasca. And the suggestibility, yeah, that's an issue, right? Psychedelics are very suggestible. You can start to believe in all kinds of things. Some people come out of it and think that they are Jesus. But, you know, a good shaman, a good practitioner knows how to differentiate between real visions, real messages, and, you know, all the psychic and unconscious fluff that you also get presented on your plate a lot, and which is mostly, let's say, anthropic. But you have to be careful to pick out the negentropic nudges. It's not a very useful term in this context, but and that's practice, that's education. These shamans in South America call ayahuasca their university. There's a whole practice and teaching and educational systems surrounding it. It's not simply taking drugs and, you know. Does that answer your question a little, Benoit?
Maybe Dan wants to add something.
I think to me there's a little bit of a contradiction between saying that there's a ritual and a symbolic context that makes it good, and saying it shatters everything that you know. Because rituals and symbols are questions of knowledge and organized knowledge, and that's what you're drawing on in saying that it's this accumulation of practices and understandings and so on that is the condition of making it negentropic, that is good. So on the one hand, it's shattering everything you know. On the other hand, its ability to function in this positive way depends on symbolic understandings, which is a question of unification, right? In the sense of Mario Giampietro. For Bernard, it was always a question of the composition of symbols and what he called diaboles. In other words, things that are dangerous but can lead to something new. And that's why politically he would say we should never demonize dangerous, bad things like, the far right and so on. The return of all those monsters, that demonizing them only causes them to return in more dangerous forms, and we need to negotiate with them in order to draw from them what can be fertile. So in that sense, I think you could look to Bernard's work for support for that idea, as long as you see that it's a question of composing symbols with what undoes symbols. But at the same time, what I don't think he would feel comfortable with, I mean, I don't want to speak in his name, but the idea of destroying the ego is something that I think he could understand as what is happening all the time today. You know, all of his arguments about the necessity of primordial narcissism, of not losing all sense of place, of cardinality and calendarity, all those things that he talks about are arguments for, it's not ever just a question of anti-entropy as some kind of transgression that leads to transcendence. We need to be able to live, and we need to be able to organize, and we need knowledge, and knowledge depends on conditions. Conditions include, forms of authority, forms of critique, and so on, all of which require education and critical education. So I think for me, it's that kind of idea. It's hard to marry this use of these kinds of drugs with all of that. At the same time, Stiegler himself used drugs, and it was connected with his ability to have new ideas at the beginning, for sure. But those drugs are a real pharmacon, and as you said, so the question of whether you can really draw out proposals for a positive future based around getting people to use those drugs, I'm pretty skeptical about. I wouldn't want to tell that to anybody. That's what I'm really saying. If people do it and they're a genius and they come up with some great new idea, yes, okay, then you can't say they did the wrong thing, but it can often come at a very heavy price and at a very heavy noetic price, and that worries me a lot.
Yeah, I fully understand. Shall I respond to this?
You can respond, Peter. Yes, if you want. Yes.
Yeah, but maybe I'm taking time of there are so many
No,
questions.
but you can respond.
What is time?
You can answer in a
Well, what can I say?
way.
It's maybe one thing. You talked about the fact that the ego is already destroyed at the moment through the digital onslaught of social media, etc., etc. That is definitely the case. I would say there's a lot of distraction and fragmentation of the psyche going on. But this is something entirely different from the ego death that one experiences under the influence of psychedelics, which is a total laying off, so to speak, of all cardinality and all calendarity, etc., and experiencing indeed a union with the divine. So the whole historical, cultural, everything that was still attached to you has to be laid off. That's also what Plotinus writes in the Aeneid. So to commune with the one, it's necessary to leave this all behind. So it's a very different and a very positive and a very enlightening and empowering form of ego death, I would say, which is very different from the one that we experience currently through digital technologies. I think you agree with that. And that they are dangerous, there's no doubt about it, and that's why it's so important to teach people about them and to have these symbolic frameworks, and also to take them out of illegality, right? It's also very important, I think.
Thank you, Peter. Morten, maybe you can ask your question.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for these two very interesting presentations. The last one sort of took me as being an old hippie many years back, although I was never initiated into any kind of rites in the same way. But actually, just recently, I was with a doctor who works scientifically and who also took ayahuasca. And when she talked about it, it was the same experience that now she really experienced something real. And then she came up with what I would identify as a quite well-known discourse. She was not religious. She didn't talk about anything spiritual, but it was kind of an ordinary discourse, which I recognized from around the time of 1970 and so on. So I would think of it, it's more real than reality, rather in the way that Zizek uses that term, which is to say that it's actually a form of discourse or ideology with which the subject is constituted, and which can then it's in you might say a kind of aesthetic expression of that, which is interesting in its own right and should be approached, I think, critically, in the sense that that Dan was talking about. Actually, that would be my approach to it if I were an anthropologist looking into that, but I'm not. But anyway, thanks for that. It's really inspiring to hear. But I was wondering, I wanted to ask you, Dan. You briefly mentioned Bruno Latour's idea that the passions of ecological change or transformations are lacking and so on. Since I'm working on the most recent book by Latour and Nikolai Schulz, which is this memo on the new ecological class. I don't know if that's at least one place where he mentions Latour, this problem. He does have a quite elaborate answer to exactly that question, what to do about it. I'm not sure if you have read it, but it seems to me that it's largely the same idea, that we have to work on critique. Basically, he says now there's a huge work that has to be done, reworking all the philosophies and all the cultures and so on in the light of this new challenge. And this is what will constitute what he calls the new class, the ecological class. And I'm curious what you would say to that argument put forward by Latour and Schulz, if you have read it.
I haven't read it, but and I was really getting that quote from the last session from Mark Willing. Maybe I can just add one little thing. So to say what I was trying to draw attention to was that Bernard's way of trying to think, how can we think about philosophy through ecological metaphor was through this idea of recycling, right? And what that, and so I talked about analysis, but what that also means is that by breaking down, decomposing, and so on, it's not just that it makes possible the new, that was a bit too much of a vague way of talking, but that it makes possible new interpretations. And it's those new interpretations that are the source of new diversity. And secondly, what I think you get from Stiegler's work is a very clear argument about how these questions about critique, interpretation, knowledge, and so on are also questions about affects, passions, and desires. That what ties them ultimately are that they are all part of a not just biological form of life in its way of organizing its way to the future. In other words, knowledge is a question of the desire to know, and the desire to know in order to live, and the desire to know in order to live not just biologically, but to live well, to live noetically is the term that Bernard would use. And so for him, what I think you get that's so important in Stiegler's work is a very clear account of how it is that the current use of these technologies not only destroys knowledge in the sense of how do we do this, how do we do that, but destroys our desire. And it does so by synchronizing, by eliminating differences as much as possible, by eliminating everything incalculable and improbable, and so on. And the only way we can undo that, the only way we can re-enchant, as Pieter said, is if we find ways of using these technologies that we can't avoid. For Stiegler, there's no future in deindustrialization. The question is how to industrialize in another way. We can only do that if we can figure out mechanisms that tend to increase our engagement with the whole history of our tertiary retentions, if we can find ways of increasing the way that they produce this can produce new interpretations and can do so collectively. And that's what he's trying to do with his institute, as Anne knows all about, and Mikael as well, to try to work out forms of software but you can never just say software, the practices of those software, which also means the ways in which you teach people how to use that software, which means that you need institutions, which means that you need criteria for those institutions, and so on, so that it all still has to be tied very much to a history and culture and cultivation of knowledge and care about knowledge, as well as desire. But at the same time, he's also very clear that for him, knowledge also means how to be a parent, how to be a good mother or a good father, how to raise one generation to be not just capable of having some brand new thought, but to be included into the whole history of thought. And when all of those things are destroyed, then people feel that their lives are without passion, and they find it very hard to get passionate, or they get passionate, but in a way that is sort of a desperate form of getting passionate. They go crazy, they go wild, they become terrorists, they become junkies, whatever. And so the possibility of radical change for Bernard, I think, always depends on knowing how we can keep what we've got rather than losing it.
Thank you very much, Dan. Maybe I will try to ask just one or two questions, and then Somak and Brian. So I just wanted to say first, I just had a very general question in order to link your presentations. I was just wondering, for Pieter, maybe more than for Dan, but the question would be, do you think that this kind of psychedelic experience can have a political role, a political value? Because at the beginning of Dan's speech, he was speaking about the question of the lack of this passion for change or the lack of political will. And I think this lack of passion for change or for political will is also linked, if we adopt, let's say, the Stiglerian framework, it is linked to a consumerist society in a way, which has led people to become consumers and not citizens anymore. And so my question was, this kind of experience, let's say spiritual experience, or when they are not, I mean, what is their political value, and at what condition can they have a political value and not be just a new instruments for consumerism or for suggestions and manipulation and or isolation of individuals? Or this would be my question, but I don't know if there is an answer. But and the second, because I think this concept of noetic life in Bernard Stiegler's philosophy, it's really a very large concept. You have the spiritual, you have also the political, you have the knowledge, you have many things inside this big, you have also the question of desire, and so everything is a bit mixed up. So yes. And the second thing is more a remark on this question of materialism, because so I was very interested by the notion of spiritual materialism, which I think is very yes, it's what Stigler is doing in a way. It's a kind of spiritual materialism, but he also used this word of hyper-materialism, which means that he does not want to be a materialist, because if he was perfectly okay with this question of materialism, he would not use this term, you know. And and this hyper-materialism is used to describe the tertiary retentions and the fact that there is spirit in the matter, and there is no spirit without matter, but there is spirit in the matter too. So it's a kind of way of going beyond the alternative between spiritualism and materialism. So I think, and there is also another concept which I was speaking about, which is the concept of consistence. You know, with the plane of consistence, and you were speaking about the fact of going through another plane or things like that. And I think this question of consistency is really important too, because it is, as always, it is a way to go beyond the alternative between immanence and transcendence, you know, saying that there is a subsistence, existence, and consistence. So we are not in a transcendent world, we are not in an immanent world, but we are in this kind of, you know, multidimensional layers of subsistence, existence, and consistence. So I wanted to ask you, yes, just what you think about that. Is it really, can we say that Stiglerian thought is pure materialism, or, you know, pure immanentism in a way? I'm not sure about that. And yes, and the last question was for Dan, but I think Dan, you already answered to that. I was just thinking about Yes, I just wanted to say that what you were saying was showing in a very clear way, I think, that the question of ecology, in a way, for Stigler, and it was the question of the politics of memory, how you manage to which is also a politic of tertiary retention. And this question was already in Derrida's reflections, and many people thought that Derrida was saying, oh, we should become vegetarian and everything, but in fact it's not at all the point. Derrida was saying the new problem, at the same time ethical and political, is the question of memory, and to establish a politics of memory, so of the recycling of the noetic necromass. And what I just wanted to add was the fact that, but you said it just a minute ago. It was, yes, in this excerpt, it is about philosophy and the critique and the analysis, which can recycle the memory of the past, but it is also a technological problem in a way. And what we can see today with technologies like ChatGPT, for example, it's really like these technologies are based on the extraction of the cultural memory. It is what you told me, but I wanted to tell it to everybody, and not on the recycling of the noetic necromass. And I think it's a very, it's also I would say, a political and a technological issue. And the people who are conceiving the technologies of artificial intelligence, for example, they could raise this kind of question, like, are we exploiting the noetic necromass, or are we giving some tools in order to recycle it? So that was just something to add, but yeah. So I don't know if you want to react or...
Thank you, Antje. Shall I react very briefly? Yeah, first your question about the possible political role of psychedelics. Yeah, I think I would be very cautious with this. I don't think psychedelics, if they have a political effect, it will be very indirect, right? I think psychedelics work on the cultural level, on the individual level, on the collective level, but also in the underground. So it's not. In indigenous cultures like this shamanic tribes in the Amazon, it's ayahuasca is the politics, right? Ayahuasca is being consulted all the time for making decisions, etc., etc. But we live in such a different non-animist culture that it is, yeah, for me at least, unimaginable. It would be good, I think, if politicians drank ayahuasca and had this kinds of experiences, CEOs, etc., etc. I think they will be taught a lot of things, but a direct politicization of such experiences, no, I would not advise that. Most people engaged in these kinds of practices are generally quite skeptical about politics and about the power of politics to change anything, right? Because politics is based on a certain understanding of society, of subjectivity, etc., etc. There's a lot of skepticism, and ayahuasca also, I think, the experience puts into question the very idea of politics as such, as we know it in the West. So, and then you talked about Stigler's spiritual materialism, which is, by the way, a term that he has introduced himself, right? To distinguish it from the more vulgar materialisms of the scientists and the philosophers of mind. Yeah, what can I don't think when I question Stigler's materialism, I really suggest taking serious the hypothesis of the existence of really non-material domains of reality, right? Like really other planes, other dimensions of reality that are accessible in certain states and that are of still to be explored nature, right? I think we have at the moment such a huge amount of experiences and empirical data of people being able to access the dimensions that we simply cannot dismiss them anymore as being, pure fantasies or simply aesthetic experiences. Morten made this suggestion. I think they're really real and not simply the fantasies of these users. But I'm not sure if that answers your question. In psychedelic circles, the hypothesis of panpsychism is very frequently put forward, and there's also another understanding of the brain that really comes to the fore in these circles, is that the brain is not so much a producer of consciousness, right? A material, a very complex organ that produces by some still mysterious means, because we haven't got a clue how it does so. And instead thinking of the mind as a receiver of consciousness, right? As a structure that receives already pre-existing streams or flows or strata of consciousness that we pick up from. This is an idea that was also entertained by Bergson in Matière Mémoire, the radio, and William James talked about this, and there are many others entertaining this idea. So this is a more, let's say, an idealist conception of the mind that comes to the fore there. So it's really questioning materialism in all its
No, but I just wanted to say that I think that there is something in Stigler's thought which is also leading to something like that, when he's saying, the number 2, it is not a material reality, the number 2, it is an ideality. You see what I mean? Or when he says, for example, the color, the yellow color for a painter, for example, it doesn't exist materially. It is an idealization, and there is all this theory of the fact that we technical beings are beings who are able to desire and to idealize the object of our desire, and the object of our desire does not exist in the same material plane.
Exactly.
You see what I mean?
It only consists in Stigler.
I think it's a bit. You can go in this direction in a way if you want to have a new kind of spiritualism or idealism, or I don't know. But I think it's a way. Just this is what I just wanted to add. But I don't know. I haven't explored the question. But
no, that's very interesting. I'm only beginning to explore it, but the idea of consistence is very important. But I think that the psychedelic experience is really an encounter of real presence, right? As George Steiner would. It's an arrival. It's not desiring anymore. It's being there. It's where arrival stops, right? Because there's nothing to desire anymore. Yeah.
But then you are far from Bernard when you say those
then
things.
I'm very far from Bernard. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I agree.
And I think for this question of consistence and the color yellow and so on, that's where you need to join this question with Husserl and the idea of primary retention and secondary retention, because for those who don't know Stigler's work, when I say tertiary retention, it's in connection with Husserl's idea about the time consciousness, which I won't explain here, but the point of it all for Bernard is that our experience, our perception, is never just a reception of the world. We're always interpreting it from the beginning, from the moment of our interpretation, and that interpretation is a kind of production of our existence. In the same way as we film a movie and then we edit it together to make it seamless for the audience. That's what we're doing in our minds when we actually are experiencing in the first place. And that's key to the question of how for Stigler it's not a question of either materialism or idealism, because he wants to say that this perception being edited and post-produced in the course of having it is something that is conditioned positively and negatively by technical artifacts. Human beings are already the product of a history of interacting with tools and so on. That means that for us, all of our perceptions are a kind of idealization. They're always involved in these schematisms, as Kant would say, but these schematisms have technological conditions. About the question that Anne asked, I'll just say about ChatGPT. When Bernard is talking about the history of information, he talks about newspapers. And newspaper is a key instance where a new tertiary retention comes along that is about reducing time, because it's in a world where things are changing and suddenly you need to know about the news. In other words, what's new, what's changing this week, this month, today, in the last hour, and so on. And so this is why the newspaper is something that has a certain value in the morning, but 24 hours later, that value has almost disappeared to nothing, and you can't sell that newspaper anymore. At the same time, he also wants to say, even if that means that we mostly read the newspaper as just a set of facts that we're taking in as information, that's not all that it is. It's also opinion. And this depends on a culture of reading the newspaper and so on, that Hegel referred to it as, you know, the morning prayer, a secular morning prayer, something like that. Yeah. And also we have the possibility of using the newspaper in other ways, of treating it not just as news, but as a document, as an archive from which we can draw other fertile revenances, as he would say. And in the same way, he would say that you can use YouTube or you can use Google in ways that are not just reduced to information and not just about the destruction of that noetic necromass and the destruction of the possibility of that humus and so on. But again, it depends on cultivating those other possibilities, teaching them, thinking about them. But where there's also a history, and it's a history of speed. There's difference in speed from the newspaper to the television news, to the 24-hour television news channel, to online news, and now to social media, blah, 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 and now to ChatGPT. So I think you have to say it's not impossible that somebody can use ChatGPT in a way that is not only destructive, because it is cutting up and mixing around the noetic necromass, but it's not doing it according to any good rules. It's just doing it according to calculations of how to produce imitations. But nevertheless, if somebody can think of improbable ways of using ChatGPT, maybe some other possibility can arise. Mostly people do that to try to make jokes or to make fun of the thing, which is not nothing. You know, a joke is not nothing, but mostly jokes evaporate and disappear too, because they just become part of the perpetually and extremely rapidly changing social media universe as well. And so the real problem is the speed with which it carries out its recycling, and the fact that this recycling done at enormous speed and much faster than we're really able to keep up with isn't done according to any thought about the future or knowledge or desire, but simply in order to be a cut-up machine.
Okay, thank you very much, Dan, and thank you, Peter, too. There are lots of questions. So, Michal, do you want to ask your question, or maybe?
No, it was Samhak and Brian before me. So
Okay. So Somak, Brian, Michal, and then there are some questions in the discussion too.
yeah,
So,
many questions.
Yeah, I will be short. Really, thank you. It's so interesting. Actually, it was not really a question, but more something that I shall be cautious personally. It's about the idea of destruction of the ego, but we really have to think of the ego as a part of oneself, and that we can exceed or overtake it or take it in charge, but not without the ego. Because, you know, what I was thinking when Pieter was presenting his talk, it was about consciousness. It just, usually people think of consciousness as one state, and actually we are always in different states of consciousness. Someone has talked about the near-death experiences, or maybe hypnosis can also induce those kinds, meditation also, but sports, not only drugs or medication. And what I wanted to say, it's more about how can policies influence and create the tendencies that allow us as oneself, but also as a community, as a humanity, to emancipate ourselves. And it's more about the idea of individuation, co-individuation, and trans-individuation, how policies can induce this or really prevent it. And today, in the Anthropocene, what we can see is that everything is destroyed, and the idea that we have to destroy the ego might be also something anthropic and not neganthropic. So I really want us to be cautious, because the words have a meaning, and sometimes when we use them too fast, we might be led in the wrong path. Voilà.
thank you very much, Somak. Maybe Brian or maybe Pieter wants to react first, and then Brian. Dano also.
Thank you. Samhak, is that the right pronunciation of your name? Thank you for this remarks. I'd rather talk of ego dissolution than destruction, right? And of course, the ego is very, very important, right? The goal of psychedelic experience is not completely to dissolve the ego. We need the ego. It's a very important psychic faculty, right? It's a defense formation, of course. We know with Freud and Jung and many others. So we need it to be able to operate in our world. So it's not to completely destroy it. But what psychedelics can teach us is that there's beyond this ego of normal consciousness, there are many different realms, much more original, much more profound, I would say, that we can access. And this is emancipatory, maybe in the sense that it gives us a more wider, a more cosmic, I would say, perspective on what we're actually involved in. And I know this sounds pretty far out and wild, but people who have experienced it, I think, can confirm this, and that's liberating. That allows for a kind of distance to daily reality and the reality of politics and culture and history, etc., the whole shebang, so to speak. But also allows for a renewed engagement with it, but from a different. I would say a transcendent perspective, a spiritual perspective, and that's the emancipatory power of it. And I think it's even, it can strengthen the ego, right? Depathologize it, allow it to deal with its traumas, with its child traumas, with its past traumas, maybe with its past life traumas, which makes it a much more healthy, powerful ego, right? So the ego should not be destroyed, my God, but it should be strengthened. and reimagined and reintegrated into this larger perspective. That's my view on it, I would say.
Yes, thank you very much for these precisions. Maybe we can hear Brian and then Michel, and then we will have to stop.
Thank you. Thank you, Anne, and thank you, Michelle, for organizing this. Peter, I thought everything you said was very interesting. As someone who's had lots of psychedelic experiences, as someone who has had addiction to such psychedelic pharmaca, and as someone who an encounter with Bernard Stiegler's work was very important in my salvation from such an experience of addiction. I have lots of things to say, but nonetheless, I have a question for Dan. It involves a very basic question about Stiegler's philosophy that still seems very mysterious to me, which is the difference between drive and desire for Stiegler. Because I love that quote where Stiegler talks about that which returns from the trauma type that doesn't lead to an experience of the extraordinary, but which just generates monsters. This idea that something is returning from the trauma type, but it does not lead to an experience of desire. It doesn't lead to an experience of the ordeal of truth. And, you know, for some reason, the concept of drive, it very much escapes me. I've been, you know, desire is easier for me to think clearly. I've been thinking about it in terms of Agamben, when he speaks of the archaeology of commandment, and he references Nietzsche, and where Nietzsche says something like, you know, every will is a commandment. You know, to me, it's very obvious that when I desire, when I have a true experience of desire, what I'm being commanded by is some spectral authority of discipline and knowledge and the criteriology of knowledge. And I would wonder how you would answer the question, like, what does the commanding in drive, like in drive-based behavior? It's a very big question. I don't think you'll have time to address it here, but it's what spoke out to me in what you said.
No, it's no problem. It's a good question, and it's one I always like to answer, because I think it's important. And sometimes I feel that some of the readers of Bernard's work want to pass over this question, or are suspicious of it, thinking it's some kind of bad psychoanalysis or something like that. So I'm going to just say it in a very simple way to get the point across, and then no doubt there are more nuances. Animals behave according to their genetic program. In other words, the selections about what behavior to engage in are determined by the programming of their DNA. Conditioned, in the case of at least higher animals, by the experiences that they have during their individual life. So that it makes it possible, because of that you can train a dog. But the way that you train a dog is either by giving it food or by giving it pain. And that tells you that you're not changing anything about the genetic program. You're changing the way that the accumulation of memories in the brain of that dog leads to some variability in the selection of behavior. Right? So already when you have brains, you have the possibility of some variability of behavioral selection. That's the whole point of having them. It's a question of memory. And it changes over the history of life. The brain of an ant is not the same as the brain of a dog. What Stiegler wants to say is, before there are human beings, there are pre-human apes that are already interacting with tools. We don't have to talk about that long history, but the point is that by the time you get to human beings, that history is already long. And it's already had effects on the constitution of our brains. Our brains are a kind of co-evolutionary product of the interaction with tools. Tools change very slowly at the beginning, and our brains change very slowly, but they change. Eventually you get to human beings. And when you get to human beings and a world that is one that they fashion themselves with their tools, it becomes the case that not only can you change behavior because of the brain, but that there is no predetermined behavior at all for the kinds of beings we are. There's nothing natural in our behavior beyond maybe suckling the breast. Once you get past that, there's not much that's natural. Everything is a question of raising, and of raising with tools, with books and so on. And that means that there are no predetermined, or the ends of the drives. In other words, we do still have hunger, but hunger is something that that is finite. You eat, and then you're not hungry, and then you get hungry again. Sex is the same thing. That our drives, what is like genetic instincts, but is not genetic instincts at all, because it can be detached from its aims. When you teach a child, you don't just give it food or electric shocks. That's a bad form of teaching, of raising a child. You use all kinds of techniques as a parent, as a teacher, which you yourself have learned from your parents and your teachers. Use all kinds of techniques to detach their drives and reattach them to new aims, desires, what you want them to do. And that includes to new aims for things that don't exist. So for example, hunger can be turned into the wish to cultivate good taste in the world's cuisine. And that's a desire, because it's infinite, it doesn't exist, you can never satisfy it, that you don't get to an end. It's a long circuit, Stiegler would say, that can last your whole life long. But it's only possible under certain conditions. And so his point is, you don't start with an instinct. We haven't got any instincts, but we do have drives that look like instincts if you don't think about it too much. But when you really think about it, there's nothing that's really an instinct for human beings. There's only the drives. And how Freud is translated makes this difficult for people to get, because of the way that trieb was translated very often as instinct in the collected works of Freud in English. What Freud doesn't talk about is what I said before about Husserl, about primary, secondary, and tertiary attention. The significance of that is, if you're editing and post-producing your experience, on what basis are you doing it? And what you get from Stiegler here is he's saying you're making selections from among possible perceptions that you could have, in the same way as this question of drive and desire is a question of making different selections of behavior. The difference here is that, so what's the same about these things is that these selections are kind of like expectations, what you think you're going to see, what you think you're going to hear. So that's why Heidegger can say, you hear the what is it, the carriage before, or let's say a car, you hear the car before you hear that it's this particular sound. You're already hearing it as a car. And that's because it's connected with desire as well in its detachment from drive. So you have to connect all these things together to get the whole picture of what Stiegler's saying about what kind of beings we are and how it is that these technologies take advantage of our openness to new aims, new attachments, new desires, but do so in a way that actually undermines that possibility. Does that help to make the concept of drive clearer? Good, I've done my job.
Yes.
Maybe Michel, you can ask your question, or yeah.
Thank you. Thank you both for your talks. I don't have a question for Peter because for a self-controlled guy I am, the experience you described is quite unavailable, right? So this idea of dissolving the ego frightens me rather than. But you know, I really loved your talk, and I need to digest it. My question to Dan is related to ChatGPT, because I think that there is still something special in this chat, namely its generative character. It generates novelties that Bernard used to identify with anti-entropy. Right? We know that these novelties still come from the most probable. So perhaps we need to distinguish between, you know, these two kinds of novelties. The one which comes from, which is computational, and the other which is beyond which is the improbable in the sense of Blanchot, and so on. But I think that perhaps it challenges a bit this distinction between the probable and the improbable in Stiegler's vocabulary and the way he understood the novelty and anti-entropy. I think that it is related to, because I think that what you talked about is the possibility or perhaps the impossibility of critique today. I really like the idea of connecting critique with analysis. You know, when you criticize, you analyze, so you decompose the object of your critique, and this is what data analytics is unable to do. It does not decompose. It rather, you know, put together the already there, which is computable and so on. But the question is about how you would see, I know it is a difficult question, how you would see the possibility to overcome this impossibility of critique in the context of generative artificial intelligence. ChatGPT is a model of, right?
For Bernard, it's when you talk about this kind of negantropy or anti-entropy, he talks about Wiener and Simondon as making similar but different mistakes. For Wiener, he says, well, I'm not saying that computers are the same, or machines are the same as life, but they're anti-entropic in a similar way to life, because they resist entropy in some way, right? And Simondon says that this is not the case, that human beings are the ones who are, or life is anti-entropic, but Machines are not, because they're not alive, right? And so, I mean, I'm simplifying a bit, but what Bernard would say is, so one of them tends to assimilate these two, the machine or the computer and life, and the other one tends to rank them. And what we need to say is that if we want to talk about the kind of anti-entropic characteristics that are specific to the kinds of beings we are, then we have to say it's with. It's always with. We are with the tool. The tool is not anti-entropic or entropic in itself. It's only in the circuit with us. And similarly, we can't separate ourselves from all of the tools that we use. Animals are negentropic beings in their struggle against entropy, but we are in a circuit with what is not alive, and only in being in that circuit have we got the possibility of struggling not just to live, but to live in a good way, which is a different question from animals. They don't have to ask how should we live. They just try to live. They don't have to ask what way to live. That's the difference, and that's a question that is a technological question. So I don't think it's that much of a challenge to Bernard's work to say that we have to make a distinction between the novelties that are produced by ChatGPT when it's doing its automated analysis and something else. What we have to say is the question is the circuit, the relationship between those novelties and us. And if there is a possibility of ChatGPT somehow making new analysis, new interpretation, new critique possible, then it's depends on our capacity to cultivate an ability to do that. Obviously, one would be highly skeptical of being able to do that in any sustained way, because these things change every 5 minutes. It operates so much faster than we can be aware of what the automated processes going on are, and it's really an automation of that analysis that you need to be able to do in a way that takes away your own ability to analyze, and that's the real threat. The analysis is, this cutting up is what you do in everything. And that's what grammatization that was Anne talked about in the last session is really about. It's cutting up temporal things in order to be able to turn them into something else. That can be programs, or it can be machines, or it can be new poems, or it can be new works of philosophy or new hypotheses in science. The question of what can we do, of course, this is always a very difficult question. You can't make things go away, but when ChatGPT arrived, immediately universities and schools felt that they were challenged by a problem. That problem was, what are we going to do if students write their essays with ChatGPT? And some institutions said, we're going to go to pen and paper. And some institutions said, you can't stop this coming. You got to live with it. We've got to teach them how to work with ChatGPT. It might sound like, from what I'm saying, that I'm saying we have to learn to work with ChatGPT. In fact, I think the complete opposite. The institutions that are doing that are not asking themselves, really, how do we adopt this technology in order to make something good? They're just giving in. They're abandoning the idea that we need to teach, really, facts, knowledge, the ability to analyze, the ability to interpret, the ability to critique, and then, you know, we'll see how we go with this ChatGPT thing. Now, what they're really doing is what education has been doing for quite a few decades, which is more and more mistaking the situation. The situation is one in which the technologies of information are the enemy of what they're trying to do, and they're in their current form, but they're constantly trying to adapt to them. And in doing so, they're just constantly giving ground and surrendering more and more to a war. So the first thing you have to say is that this is a question of education, and the number one issue is to recreate education, recreate the university, recreate the high school, recreate the primary school, and at the same time to think about what that means for parenting and so on. Gigantic questions, of course, but to me, it's really the question of education. And that's why, for me, it's always important to remember Stigler is not just the guy who's talking about computers. He's a guy who's talking about what it means to raise new generations in a world of rapidly changing technologies of information and knowledge.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Yes. Peter, you wanted to say something? And
yeah, I did, but Brian has left the room already, so I had a command. For him. He's not there anymore, right? Or is it? No.
No, I don't think so.
So I don't have an additional question.
Okay, maybe a conclusion. Because I think I know that there were lots of questions in the chat. Maybe I think Marco had a question, maybe, but I don't remember where it is and what it is exactly. And there are many other questions, but I'm sorry, I've been a bit, I didn't manage to follow the discussion in the chat because there were many discussions at the same time. So maybe we have the time for just the last question of Marco, and then we can maybe we can. Yeah, no, it's. But Marco, you cannot speak. Is that it? Yes.
Okay, but I think
you have it, Peter?
Yeah, I have it. I have it.
Great. Okay, maybe we can conclude on this. It would be.
Yeah. This. Do you think one could understand psychedelics as technology in the sense of Stigler, that is, as tertiary memory, inorganic organized matter? Well, that's obviously not the case, of course. That psychedelics are pharmaca, but they're organic. Right, they're vegetal or animal. They have their own subjectivity, right? So to really translate that into Stiglerian terminal, that's going to be different, but that's something that I would like to try. But it's obviously not tertiary memory, inorganic organized matter. And then you say, if yes, shall we amend this understanding to any extent, since Stigler hardly speaks of them in his analysis? No, he does not speak in them, although there are a few places in Stigler's work where he mentions shamanism as a kind of technology of the self. If no,
but if it's a cultivated plant, it is possible it's you know, organized.
Yeah.
Technological in the sense of cultivation.
Yeah, well, mushrooms are not cultivated, but the thing with ayahuasca is that it is a product of cultivation. It is a mixture of plants, but it is certainly a kind of technology, and there is you could think of ayahuasca having a kind of epiphylogenetic, let's say, effect, but you have to take into account, you know, spirits, other subjectivities with which humans communicate and you know, put up a tradition. It's wholly different. It's what happens, of course, in the Amazon in the oral tribes where shamanism is practiced, and it's a very different techniques of ecstasy and technologies of the self. So it's, but I'm working on this, and that's what I try to engage in. This talk was simply the first attempt. I hope that is sufficient for you now, Marco.
Thank you very much.
We see each other soon, right?
Maybe we can stop now, because for my part, I think I will have to go, and I think we had a very great session, and also for Dan, I guess it is 3 o'clock in the morning now.
Yeah.
I don't know.
4:30.
4:30. Oh my God! Oh my God!
Lots of respect, Dan. Thanks a lot, really.
Thank you very
for your
much, Dan.
talk.
Yeah, it was very, very nice to you to accept this this challenge. And thank you to everybody who is still here for being with us. Thank you, Peter, too.
Thank you for your attention. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, so we will meet next month for this seminar, and anyway, we will meet with everybody in other occasions. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Anna.
And have a good night. Yeah.
Goodbye. Thanks. Bye bye.
See you.
All of you. Bye bye.